The fifth reading from The Way of the Pilgrim. We left off with, and prayed that God would so order things that the clerk might also read the Philokalia, even if only once, and let him find salvation through it. Another time, it was in spring, I passed through a village where I stayed with the priest. He was a worthy man, living alone, and I spent 3 days with him. Having watched me for that length of time, he said to me, "Stay here. I will pay you something. I need a trustworthy man. As you see, we are starting to build the stone church here near the old wooden chapel, and I have been looking for some honest person to keep an eye on the workmen and stay in the chapel in charge of the offerings for the building fund. It is exactly the thing for you, and would just suit your way of life. You will be alone in the chapel and say your prayers. There is a quiet room for a verger there. Please stay, at any rate, until the building is finished." For a long time I refused, but in the end I had to yield to the good priest's begging, and I stayed there till the autumn, taking up my abode in the chapel. At first I found it quiet and apt for prayer, although a great many people came to the chapel, especially on holidays, some to say their prayers, some because they were bored, and others against with the idea of pilfering from the collection plate. I read my Bible and my Philokalia every evening, and some of them saw this and started talking to me about it, or asked me to read aloud. After a while, I noticed that a young village girl often came to the chapel and spent a long time in prayer. Listening to her whisperings, I found that the prayers she was saying were some of them strange to me, and others the usual prayers in a garbled form. I asked her where she learned such things. She told me it was from her mother, who was a churchwoman, but that her father belonged to a sect that had no priesthood. Feeling sorry for her, I advised her to read her prayers in the right form, as given by the tradition of Holy Church. Then I taught her the right wording of the Lord's Prayer and of the Hail Mary, and finally I advised her to say the prayer of Jesus as often as she could, for that brought one nearer to God than any other prayer. The girl took note of what I said and set about it quite simply. And what happened? A short time afterward she told me that she was so used to the prayer that she felt it draw her all the time, that she used it as much as she could, that she enjoyed the prayer at the time, and that afterward she was filled with gladness and a wish to begin using it again. I was glad of this, and advised her to go on with it more and more. Summer was driving to a close. Many visitors to the chapel came to see me also, not only to be read to and to ask for advice, but all sorts of worldly trouble, and even to ask about things that they had mislaid or lost. Some of them seemed to take me for a wizard. The girl I spoke about also came to me one day in a state of great distress and worry, not knowing what to do. Her father wanted to her father wanted to make her marry a man of his own religion, and they were to be married not by a priest, but by a mere peasant belonging to the same sect. How could that be a lawful marriage? Wouldn't it be the same as fornication? Cried the girl. She had made up her mind to run away somewhere or other. But, said I, where to? They would be sure to find you again. They would look everywhere, and you wouldn't be able to hide anywhere from them. You had better pray earnestly to God to turn your father from his purpose and to guard your soul from sin and heresy. That is a much sounder plan than running away. Thus time passed, and all this noise and fuss began to be more than I could bear. And at last, at the end of summer, I made up my mind to leave the chapel and to go on with my pilgrimage as before. I told the priest what was in my mind, saying, "You know my plans, Father. I must have quiet for prayer, and here it is very disturbing and bad for me. And I have spent the whole summer here. Now let me go and give your blessing on my lonely journey." But the priest did not want me to go, and tried to get me to stay. "What is there to hinder your praying here? Your work is nothing to speak of, beyond stopping in the chapel. You have your daily bread. Say your prayers then all day and all night if you like, and live with God. You are lawful here. You don't go in for silly gossip with the people coming in. You are a source of profit for the church. All that is worth more in God's sight than your prayers all by yourself. Why do you always want to be alone? Common prayer is pleasanter. God did not create man to think of himself only, but that men should help each other and lead each other along the path of salvation, each according to his strength. Think of the saints and the fathers of the church. They bustled about day and night. They cared for the needs of the church. They used to preach all over the place. They didn't sit down alone and hide themselves from people. Everyone has their own gift from God. Hello. Well, you missed the join call. Oh, where? Are you still there? Oh, okay. How long does it take you to get back? Oh, you bring in the priest? Is he still there? Ooh. Oh, the interruption. Sorry for the interruption. So to continue onward. Her father wanted her to make her marry a man of his own religion, and they were to be married not by a priest but a mere peasant belonging to the same sect. Now how can that be a lawful marriage? Wouldn't it be the same thing as fornication? Cried the girl. She made up her mind to run away, somewhere or other. But, said I, where to? They would be sure to find you again. They will look everywhere, and you won't be able to hide anywhere from them. You had better pray earnestly to God to turn your father from his purpose, and to guard your soul from sin and heresy, which is much sounder plan than running away. Thus time passed away, and all this noise and fuss began to be more than I could bear. And at last, at the end of summer, I made up my mind to leave the chapel and to go on with my pilgrimage as before. I told the priest what was in my mind, saying, "You know my plans, Father. I must have quiet for prayer." And here it is very disturbing and bad for me, and I have spent the whole summer here. Now let me go and give your blessing on my lonely journey. But the priest did not want to let me go, and tried to get me to stay. Where is there to hinder your praying here? Your work is nothing to speak of, beyond stopping in the chapel. You have your daily bread. Say your prayer then all day and all night if you like, and live with God. You are useful here. You don't go in for silly gossip with people who come here. You are a source of profit to the church. All that is worth more in God's sight than your prayers all by yourself. Why do you always want to be alone? Common prayer is pleasanter. God did not create man to think of himself only, but that men should help each other and lead each other along the path to salvation, each according to his strength. Think of the saints and the fathers of the church. They bustled about day and night. They cared for the needs of the church. They used to preach all over the place. They didn't sit down alone and hide themselves from people. Everyone has his own gift from God, I answered. There have been many preachers, Father, but there have also been many hermits. Everyone does what he can, as he sees his own path, with the thought that God himself shows him the way of his salvation. How do you get over the fact that many of the saints gave up their positions as bishops or priests or the rule of a monastery and went into the desert to get away from the fuss which comes from living with other people? St. Isaac the Syrian, for instance, fled from the flock whose bishop he was, and the venerable Athanasius of Athos left his large monastery just because to them these places were a source of temptation, and they sincerely believed our Lord saying, "What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?" "Ah, but they were saints," said the priest. "And if," I answered, "the very saints took steps to guard themselves from the dangers of mingling with people, what else, I ask you, can a feeble sinner do?" So in the end, I said goodbye to this good priest, and he, out of love in his heart, set me on my way. Some half-dozen miles farther on, I stopped for the night at a village. At the inn there, I found a peasant hopelessly ill, and I advised those who were with him to see that he had the last sacraments. They agreed, and toward the morning sent for the parish priest. I stayed there too, because I wanted to worship and pray in the presence of the holy gifts, and going out into the street, sat down on the Zolina to wait for the priest to come. All at once I was astonished to see running toward me from the backyard the girl who used to pray in the chapel. "What brings you here?" I asked. They had all fixed the day of my betrothal to the man I told you of, so I left them. And kneeling before me, she went on, "Have pity on me. Take me with you, and put me into some convent or other. I don't want to be married. I want to live in a convent and say the Jesus prayer. They will listen to you and take me." "Goodness!" I exclaimed. "And where am I to take you to? I do not know a single convent in this neighborhood. Besides, I can't take you anywhere without a passport. For one thing, you wouldn't be taken in anywhere, and for another, it would be quite impossible for you to hide nowadays. You would be caught at once and sent home again and punished as a tramp into the bargain. You had far better go home and say your prayers there. And if you don't want to marry, make out that you are ill." Holy Mother Clementa did that, and so did the Venerable Marina when she took refuge in a men's convent. There are many other cases of the same thing. It is called a saving pretense. While all this was happening, and we sat talking the matter over, we saw 4 men driving up the road with a pair of horses, and coming straight toward us at a gallop. They seized the girl and put her in the cart, and one of them drove off with her. The other 3 tied my hands together and haled me back to the village where I had spent the summer. Their only reply to everything I said for myself was to shout, "We'll teach the little saint to seduce young girls." That evening they brought me to the village court, put my feet in irons, and lodged me in jail to await my trial in the morning. The priest heard that I was in prison and came to see me. He brought me some supper and comforted me, saying that he would do what he could for me and give his word as a spiritual father that I was not sort of the person they thought. After sitting with me for a while, he went away. The magistrate came late in the evening, driving through the village on his way to somewhere else, and stopped at the deputy's house, where they told him what had happened. He bade the peasants to come together, and brought me to the house which was used as a court. We went in and stood waiting. In comes the magistrate, blustering, and sits down on the table with his hat on. "Hi, Epiphan," he shouts. "Did the girl, this daughter of yours, run off with anything from your house?" "No, sir, nothing," was the answer. "Has she been found out doing anything wrong with that fool there?" "No, sir." "Well, then, this is my decision and my judgment in the matter. You deal with your daughter yourself, and as for this fellow, we'll teach him a lesson tomorrow, and throw him out of the village with strict orders never to show his face here again. So that's that." So saying, he got down from the table and went off to bed, while I was taken back to jail. Early in the morning, 2 country policemen came, flogged me, and drove me out of the village. I went off thanking God that he counted me worthy to suffer for his name. This comforted me and gave me more warmth and glow to my ceaseless interior prayer. None of these things made me feel at all cast down. It was as though they had happened to someone else, and I merely watched them. Even the flogging was within my power to bear. The prayer brought sweetness into my heart, and made me unaware, so to speak, of everything else. A mile or 2 farther on, I met the girl's mother, coming home from the market with what she had bought. Seeing me, she told me that the son-in-law had to be withdrawn, that the son-in-law to be had withdrawn his suit. You see, he is annoyed with Akula for having run away from him. Then she gave me some bread and patties, and I went on my way. The weather was fine and dry, and I had no wish to spend the night in a village. So when I came upon 2 fenced-in haystacks, as I went through the forest that evening, I lay down beneath them for a night's lodging. I fell asleep and dreamed that I was walking along and reading a chapter of St. Anthony the Great from the Philokalia. Suddenly my starets overtook me and said, "Don't read that, read this," and pointed to these words in the 35th chapter of St. John of Carpathos. A teacher submits at times to ignominy and endures pain for the sake of his spiritual children. And again he made me note in the 41st chapter, "Those who give themselves most earnestly to prayer, it is they who become the prey of terrible and violent temptations." Then he said, "Take courage and do not be downcast. Remember the apostles' words, 'Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world.' You see that you have now had experience of the truth, and no temptation is beyond men's strength to resist, and that with the temptation God makes also the way of escape. Reliance upon this divine help has strengthened holy men of prayer, and led them on to greater zeal and ardor. They not only devoted their own lives to ceaseless prayer, but also out of love of their hearts revealed it and taught it to others as opportunity occurred." St. Gregory of Thessalonica speaks of this as follows: "Not only should we ourselves, in accordance with God's will, pray unceasingly in the name of Jesus Christ, but we are bound to reveal it and teach it to others, to everyone in general, religious and secular, learned and simple, men, women, and children, and to inspire them all with a zeal for prayer without ceasing." In the same way, Venerable Callistus Telecuda says, "One ought not to keep thoughts about God, i.e., interior prayer, and what is learned by contemplation, and the means of raising the soul on high, simply in one's own mind, but one should make notes of it, put it into writing for general use and a loving motive. And the Scripture saw in this connection, 'Brother is helped by brother like a strong and lofty city,' Proverbs 18, verse 19. Only in this case it is above all things necessary to avoid self-praise and to take care that the seed of divine teaching is not sown to the wind. I woke up feeling great with joy in my heart and strength in my soul. I went on my way. A long while after this, something else happened, which also I will tell you about if you like. One day, it was on the 24th of March to be exact, I felt a very urgent wish to make my communion the next day, that is, on the feast of the Annunciation of Our Lady. I asked whether the church was far away and was told it was about 20 miles. So I walked for the rest of that day and all the next night in order to get there in time for Matins. The weather was as bad as it could be. It snowed and rained, there was a strong wind, and it was very cold. On my way I had to cross a small stream, and just as I got to the middle, the ice gave way under my feet, and I was plunged into the water up to my waist. Drenched like this, I came to Matins and stood through it, and also through the liturgy which followed, and at which, by God's grace, I made my communion, in order to spend the day quietly and without spoiling my spiritual happiness. I begged the verger to allow me to stay in his little room until the next morning. I was more happy than I can tell all that day. My heart was full of joy. I lay on the plank bed in that unheated room, as though I was resting in Abraham's bosom. The prayer was very active. The love of Jesus Christ and of the Mother of God seemed to surge into my heart in waves of sweetness and to steep my soul in consolation and triumph. At nightfall I was seized with violent rheumatic pains in my legs, and that brought to my mind that they were soaking wet. I took no notice of it, and set my heart more to my prayer, so that I no longer felt the pain. In the morning, when I wanted to get up, I found that I could not move my legs. They were quite paralyzed, and as feeble as bits of string. The verger dragged me down off the bed by main force, and so there I sat for 2 days without moving. On the 3rd day the verger set about turning me out of his room. "For," said he, "supposing you die here, what a fuss there will be." With the greatest difficulty I somehow or other crawled along on my arms and dragged myself to the steps of the church and lay there. And there I stayed for a couple of days. The people who went by passed me without taking the slightest notice either of me or my pleadings. In the end, a peasant came up to me and sat down and talked, and after a while he asked, "What will you give me if I cure you?" I had just exactly the same thing once. I know a medicine for it. "I have nothing to give you," I answered. "But what have you got in your bag?" "Only dried bread and some books." "Well, what about working for me just one summer if I cure you?" "I can't do any work, as you see. I have only the use of one arm, and the other is almost entirely withered." "Then what can you do?" "Nothing, beyond the fact that I can read and write." "Ah, I write. Well, teach my little boy to write. He can read a little, and I want him to be able to write too. But it costs such a lot. They want 20 rubles to teach him." I agreed to this, and with the verger's help he carried me away and put me in an old empty bathhouse in his backyard. Then he set about curing me, and this was his method. He picked up from the floors, the yards, the cesspools, the best part of a bushel of various sorts of putrid bones, bones of cattle, of birds, all sorts. He washed them and broke them up small with a stone, and put them into a great earthen pot. This he covered with a lid, which had a small hole in it, and placed upside down on an empty jar sunk in the ground. He smeared the upper pot with a thick coating of clay, and making a pile of wood around it, he set fire to this and kept it burning for more than 24 hours, saying as he fed the fire, Now we'll get some tar from the bones. Next day, which he took the lower jar out of the ground, there had dripped into it through the hole in the lid of the other jar about a pint of thick, reddish, oily liquid, with a strong smell like living raw meat. As for the bones left in the jar, nothing being black and putrid, they had become white and clean and transparent like mother of pearl. I rubbed my legs with this liquid 5 times a day, and lo and behold, 24 hours later, I found that I could move my toes. Another day, and I could bend my legs and straighten them. On the 5th day, I stood on my feet, and with the help of a stick, walked about the yard. In a word, in a week's time, my legs became fully as strong as they were before. I thanked God and mused about the mysterious power which he has given his creatures. Dry, putrid bones, almost brought to dust, yet keeping such vital force, color, smell, power of acting on living bodies, as it were giving life to bodies that were half dead. It was a pledge of the future resurrection of the body. How I would like to point this out to that forester with whom I lived, in view of his doubts about the general resurrection. Having in this way got better from my illness, I began to teach the boy. Instead of the usual copybook work, he wrote out the prayer of Jesus. I made him copy it, showing him how to set out the words nicely. I found teaching the lad restful, for during the daytime he worked for the steward of an estate nearby, and could only come to me while the steward slept, that is, from daybreak till the liturgy. He was a bright boy, and soon began to write fairly well. His employer saw him writing and asked him who had taught him. "A one-armed pilgrim who lives in our old bathhouse," said the boy. The steward, who was a Pole, was interested, and came to have a look at me. He found me reading the Philokalia and started a talk by asking what I was reading. I showed him the book. "Ah," said he, "that's the Philokalia. I've seen the book before at the priest's when I lived in Vilna. They tell me, however, that it contains odd sorts of schemes and tricks for prayer written down by the Greek monks. It's like those fanatics in India who sit down and blow themselves out trying to get a sort of tickling in their hearts, and in their stupidity take this bodily feeling for prayer, and look upon it as a gift from God. All that is necessary to fulfill one's duty to God is to pray simply and to stand and say the Our Father as Christ taught us. That puts you right for the whole day, but not to go on over and over again to the same tune. That, if I may say so, is enough to drive you mad. Besides, it's bad for your heart. Don't think in that way about this holy bull, sir," I answered. "It was not written by simple Greek monks, but by great and holy men of olden times, men whom your church honors also, such as Anthony the Great, Macarius the Great, Mark the spiritual athlete, John Chrysostom, and others. It was from them that the monks of India and Bokhara took over the heart method of interior prayer, only they quite spoiled and garbled it. In doing so, as my studies explained to me, in the Philokalia, all the teaching about the practice of prayer in the heart is taken from the Word of God, from the Holy Bible, in which the same Jesus Christ, who bade us to say the Our Father, taught also ceaseless prayer in the heart. For he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind. Watch and pray. Abide in me, I tell you." And the Holy Fathers, calling to witness the holy King David's words in the Psalms, "O taste and see how gracious the Lord is," explain the passage thus: the Christian man ought to use every possible means of seeking and finding delight in prayer, and ceaselessly to look for consolation in it, and not be content with simply saying Our Father once a day. Let me read to you how these saints blame those who do not strive to reach the gladness of the prayer of the heart. They write that no such they write that such do wrong for three reasons. Firstly, because they show themselves against the scriptures inspired by God. And secondly, because they do not set before themselves a higher and more perfect state of soul to be reached. They are content with outward virtues only, and cannot hunger and thirst for the truth, and therefore miss the blessedness and joy in the Lord. Thirdly, because they are letting their mind dwell upon themselves with their outward virtues, they often slip into temptation and pride, so fall away. It is sublime what you are reading, said the steward, but it is hardly for us ordinary layfolk, I think. Well, I'll read you something simpler about how people of good will, even if living in the world, may learn how to pray without ceasing. I found the sermon on George the Youth by Simeon, the new theologian, and read it to him from the Philokalia. This pleased him, and he said, "Give me that book to read at my leisure, and I will have a good look into it for some time." "I will let you have it for 24 hours with pleasure," I answered, "but not for longer, because I read it every day, and I just can't live without it." "Well, then, at least copy out for me what you have just read, and I will pay you for your trouble." "I don't want payment," said I. "I will write that out for you for love's sake, and in the hope that God give you a longing for prayer." At once and with pleasure I made a copy of the sermon I had read. He read it to his wife, and both of them were pleased with it. And so came about that at that time they would send for me, and I would go, taking the Philokalia with me, and read it to them while they sat drinking tea and listening. Once they asked me to stay to dinner. The steward's wife, who was a kindly old lady, was sitting with us at table, eating some fried fish, when by some mischance she got a bone lodged in her throat. Nothing we could do gave her any relief, and nothing would move the bone. Her throat gave her so much pain that a couple of hours later she had to go and lie down. The doctor, who lived 20 miles away, was sent for, and as by this time it was evening, I went home feeling very sorry for her. That night, while I was sleeping lightly, I heard my Stauratz's voice. I saw no figure, but I heard him say to me, "The man you are living with cured you. Why then do you not help the steward's wife? God has bidden us feel for our neighbor." "I would help her gladly," I answered. "But how? I know no means whatever." "Well, this is what you must do. From her very earliest years she had a dislike of oil. She not only will not taste it, but cannot bear even the smell of it without being sick. So make her drink a spoonful of oil. It will make her vomit, and the bone will come out. The oil will soothe the sore the bone has made in her throat, and she will be well again. And how am I to give it to her if she dislikes it so? She will refuse to drink it. Get the steward to hold her head and pour it suddenly into her mouth, even if you have to use force." I woke up and went straight off and told the steward all this in detail. "What good can your oil do now?" said he. "She is hoarse and delirious, and her neck is all swollen." "Well, at any rate, let us try. Even if it doesn't help, oil is at least harmless as medicine." He poured some into a wine-glass, and somehow or other we got her to swallow it. She was violently sick at once, and soon vomited up the bone and some blood. She began to feel easier, and fell into a deep sleep. In the morning I went to ask her after her, and found her sitting quietly taking her tea. Both she and her husband were full of wonder at the way she had been cured, and even greater than that was their surprise that her dislike of oil had been told to me in a dream. Far apart from themselves, not a soul knew of that fact. Just then the doctor also drove up, And the steward told him what had happened to his wife. And I, in turn, told him how the peasant had cured my legs. The doctor listened to it all, and then said, "Neither the one case nor the other is greatly to be wondered at. It is the same natural force which operated in both cases. Still I shall make note of it." And he took out a pencil and wrote in his notebook. After this report quickly spread throughout the whole neighborhood that I was a prophet and a doctor and a wizard, there began a ceaseless stream of visitors from all parts to bring their affairs and their troubles to my notice. They brought me presents and began to treat me with respect and to look after my comfort. I bore this for a week, and then, fearing I should fall into vainglory and harmful distractions, I left the place secretly by night. We will then pick this up in the 6th reading. God bless.